Ballast seeds are kind of the living history of trade of the city.
At first the idea seems very simple, but then when you really understand then that the real intent of the project for the artist is this idea of these plants being a kind of metaphor or a map, that's when it becomes not a garden but a conceptual artwork in the form of a garden.
The Seeds of Change project actually has its origins back in 2007 in the Port City project. If you think of a place like Bristol, it was really kind of built around maritime trade. I mean, the reason for Bristol existing really is the ships that would come into port from all around the world over many centuries. And Port City really wanted to reflect on that, but look at how we're all implicated in those histories today. We commissioned Maria Thereza Alves to make a project as part of Port City. And I knew that she was very interested in ballast seeds. Ballast is essentially what ships use to weigh them down, to keep them at a certain level in the water. So up until the turn of this century, ships would use earth and stones, or anything that came to hand in the port of exit, if you like. Within that would be seeds. And the great discovery that Maria Thereza had was that these seeds that came with the ballast that was offloaded when ships came into port could lie dormant for hundreds of years, which is really amazing, because if you think, all of our ports are kind of full of all of that history lying in the riverbanks. She started out by researching all the sites around the city where ballast would have been dumped. Ships would inevitably want to get rid of it without having to pay the taxes, so they would dump it along the riverbanks. She then decided the next thing to do was, rather than just do it herself to germinate these plants out of these samples of earth, to share that process out with different communities around the city who'd got relationships with port cities around the world. So that was a really exciting part of the project, and that really expanded the way that we went about it. So rather than it just being about, you know, the artist and their idea, it became about community as well, and how people found their own meanings within it, and their own histories were kind of brought to life through the project as well.
Hello everybody, and welcome to the Ballast Garden boat tour. And I just wanted to give you a little bit of background to the tour. So in 2007, Arnold Feeney started working with an artist called Maria Thereza Alves, and she was really interested in the history of port cities.
The design of the barge needs to follow the function of the barge, so it needed to be designed following, for instance, to cover up the hold, to be able to irrigate itself, for it to be safe so people didn't fall off. So early on in the project we identified Gitta to work closely with Maria Thereza Alves to develop the design, and it became a collaboration between the two of them.
I've never designed a garden, let alone on a barge, so there was a lot to research in terms of what kind of materials to use, how the structure will bear up, how we're going to irrigate the garden, and being as sustainable as possible. Myself and Maria Thereza talked about getting the right aesthetic for the garden. So it was up to me to create something that showed off the concept in a way that is relatively neutral without kind of too much fuss, but at the same time telling a story and immersing the visitors into the experience.
No, that'd be spread by wind, wouldn't it?
Yes, absolutely. Sorry.
I think that's the husk, and the little black ones are
and the black ones are the seeds.
That makes sense.
The University of Bristol Botanic Garden has been involved in the project from day one, particularly as part of the design process of how this barge planting looks, and also which species would be grown on the project. It was important in selecting these plants for this project that we had accurate records that these species had occurred from the ballast of ships' holds that's been deposited on the quayside. There are many plants here that people are familiar with and have been grown for many years in British gardens, but what's not realised is that the plants can travel around the world as stowaways or in the holds of ships. And I think that's really interesting. And I think what's also a surprise to people is the immense length of time that some of these plants have been cultivated. They've been with us really since the dawn of civilization. The plants have been grouped together in blocks. They don't appear higgledy-piggledy as they would in nature. The advantage of these blocks is that each block gives more impact of colour, shape, form and texture when the plants are growing. So in the winter months,
it's been very interesting to see an off-site project with Arnolfini, an ongoing off-site project where the gallery space extends out onto the barge, where there are talks and events outside of the gallery space.
Now, there's a quite extraordinary plant on board here, and I don't want to worry you, but it is explosive.
I especially like the exploding cucumbers, and I recognise a few plants from my garden, and I'm going to go home and plant these.
I went to the Origins Centre in South Africa, which talks a lot about the evolution of humankind. It was fascinating looking at the evolution of plants and what we then do to that by moving them around the planet.
For us, one of the most important parts of this entire project is engagement and how we can bring different audiences to come and animate this floating ballast seed garden. So in 2007 we worked with various community groups that had immigrant backgrounds into Bristol. And for this manifestation of the project we're going to develop ballast seed gardens with 10 primary schools and 5 community groups across the city. And as you'll see behind me, there's young people at the moment who are studying art, photography, we've got history. So this barge becomes a living history of Bristol.
Arnolfini has always been about experimental arts, but it's also always focused on engagement and trying to involve as many people as possible in that conversation. And obviously Bristol City Council have championed this floating garden, which has been fantastic. The next phase after the floating garden is for schools to start to grow their own gardens and really get involved that way. So this is a really good example of how art can become meaningful in a wider social context.